All right, so are you ready to like dive deep into these Trump rallies? I
Mhm.
mean, we got a whole stack of transcripts here. And it's not just like the same old stuff, it's wild. He's saying he like personally stopped World War III just by making a phone call. And get this, China. China's why Afghanistan went down, not his own policies or anything. Okay, so to help us unpack all this, we've got expert speaker here.
Um, yeah, it's really interesting to see how Trump's mixing these familiar themes, yeah,
Yeah.
but like with this noticeable increase in intensity, like way more intense. Like take his claims about election rigging, for instance. It's not just about the past anymore. Now he's trying to discredit any future losses too.
Mm.
Like he's setting the stage now, well in advance.
Yeah, it's like he's writing the sequel before the first movie even comes out,
Yeah.
And the language he's using is so much more intense. He's calling Democrats Marxists, communists, lunatics. He even said enemies from within. Like he's
Yeah.
cranking up the fear factor to 11. So like how do you think this kind of rhetoric is landing with his base? What do you think?
Well, this kind of rhetoric really taps into those anxieties people already have,
Mm-hmm.
and it just like amplifies them. So it's about economic anxieties, for sure, cultural anxieties,
Mm-hmm.
and anxieties about losing power and status. It's a way to solidify that us versus them story he's always telling. And by painting his opponents as not just wrong, but actually dangerous,
Yeah.
existential threats even, well, then he gets to cast himself as like the hero, the one and only defender against this like looming apocalypse.
And it's interesting because it feels like the attacks are getting way more personal this time around, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to Kamala Harris. I mean, he's going after everything, her policies, her record. He even brought up that totally debunked story about her working at McDonald's.
And let's not forget about his comment about Harris and like sex changes for undocumented immigrants. There's absolutely no basis in reality for that. It's just not true.
Yeah, it feels like he's going straight for the jugular, trying
Yeah.
to discredit her personally instead of actually, debating policy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And he's used this strategy before, but it's way more pronounced now. He's trying to tap into these like deep anxieties and prejudices, even if he has to totally make stuff up.
Mm-hmm.
It's about getting that gut reaction, not about starting a thoughtful conversation.
It's funny. For someone who's always talking about truth and straight talk, there are a lot of inconsistencies in his policy positions. Like, one minute he's all about tariffs, the next minute he's criticizing them for hurting businesses.
Mhm.
He wants to increase military spending, but also reduce foreign entanglements.
Yeah, and then there are those like vague sweeping statements, like make America affordable again or bring back the American dream. They sound good, but like what do they actually mean in terms of like real policies?
Exactly, it's all solutions, but no acknowledgement of how complicated things really are. What's your take on this? Are these like genuine policy positions he believes in, or is he just trying to appeal to different groups within his base, even if it means contradicting himself?
Well, there's definitely some strategic ambiguity going on here. Like, on the one hand, these vague pronouncements allow him to appeal to a much wider audience because everyone can just like project their own desires and interpretations onto those promises.
It's like a political Rorschach test.
Exactly. But then on the other hand, it's hard to ignore the contradictions. Like he talks about how successful his tariffs were, how they brought in billions from China. But then he also admits there were negative impacts, especially in places like Pennsylvania, which is a state he really needs to win. It's a tough balancing act.
Speaking of Pennsylvania and those manufacturing jobs he promised to bring back, like how much of that actually happened?
Well, it's not as simple as just offering tax breaks to companies that build in America, like the globalized nature of supply chains. And honestly, the rise of automation. That's had a huge impact on manufacturing. It's a complex issue. You can't solve it with just one policy or slogan.
So once again, he's simplifying a complex issue, offering a simple solution to a complex problem. It's about tapping into that desire for easy answers, even if those answers are totally unrealistic.
Exactly. And that's something to keep in mind when you're listening to these rallies. It's not just about what he's saying. It's also about what he's not saying. You have to read between the lines. Look for the missing pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah, it's like he's playing this game of three-card Monte with the truth. And speaking of sleight of hand, let's talk about immigration. He's painting this picture of the border being overrun, criminals, terrorists. He even said people from mental institutions.
He claims that Biden reversed all of his successful border policies, which he says led to the lowest level of illegal immigration in history. And according to Trump, all Biden had to do was reinstate his policies, like remain in Mexico.
Hold on, didn't those policies face a ton of legal challenges and criticism for being a violation of human rights?
You're totally right. Trump's policies did lead to a decrease in border crossings, but they also caused a lot of controversy and were tied up in court cases, like The Remain in Mexico policy forced asylum seekers to wait in dangerous conditions in Mexico, while their cases were being processed in U.S. courts. It's a complicated issue, with no easy solutions, despite how he tries to frame it.
Yeah, it seems like his approach to immigration is less about finding solutions that actually work, and more about stirring up fear and resentment. He even said it would be safer for his supporters in Michigan to have their rally in Caracas, Venezuela instead, because he claims crime rates are down all over the world because other countries are sending their criminals to the U.S.
That's a classic example of using hyperbole to make a point, even if that point is based on a distortion of the facts. While some countries have seen crime rates go down, blaming it solely on the deportation of criminals to the U.S. is a huge oversimplification. It ignores so many factors, like economic conditions, social programs, and law enforcement strategies.
Right. So if fear-mongering is the name of the game when it comes to immigration, what about the economy? He keeps saying the American dream is dead under Biden and Harris. He blames them for inflation and rising costs. He even told the story about a woman who couldn't afford to buy 3 apples at the grocery store. Is that like the reality for most Americans right now?
Well, the economy is definitely a top concern for voters. Inflation has been a huge issue. It's affecting how much everything costs. But blaming it all on Biden and Harris's policies is way too simplistic. Global factors have played a big role too, like supply chain problems from the pandemic
Right.
and the war in Ukraine.
So it's not as simple as he makes it sound.
It's almost never that simple. The economy is like this massive engine with a million moving parts. It's impossible to blame its performance on just one person or thing.
But he's offering solutions, though, right? He keeps talking about making America affordable again, bringing back manufacturing jobs, and those big tax cuts he did during his first term. He's telling voters he can make all those economic anxieties disappear.
He's definitely trying to paint a picture of like economic utopia under his leadership. But we have to look beyond the surface and examine the details, like his claims about the success of his tax cuts. While they did stimulate the economy a little bit in the short term, they mostly benefited wealthy people and corporations, which makes income inequality even worse.
And those manufacturing jobs he promised, didn't they mostly go to automation, not American workers?
Exactly. Manufacturing is changing so fast, and it's mostly because of automation. While some jobs have come back to the U.S., many have been replaced by robots. It's a complex problem, and tariffs and tax cuts aren't going to fix it, no matter how many times he promises to bring back coal mining jobs.
It feels like he's selling this idea of going back to a simpler time, when things were easier, even if that simplicity was kind of an illusion. And what about energy? He's constantly criticizing Biden for shutting down pipelines and restricting American energy production. He says that's why we're all paying more for gas. And he promises to unleash American energy dominance.
Drill, baby, drill, you know. He even said he could cut energy costs in half within a year. Is that even remotely possible?
Well, you have to remember that energy is another one of those issues that's connected to the rest of the world. Biden canceling the Keystone XL pipeline and pausing new oil and gas leases on federal land definitely upset the fossil fuel industry. But global energy markets are influenced by so many things: OPEC production, geopolitical tensions, and the growing demand for renewable energy sources.
So it's not as simple as just turning on the taps and flooding the market with American oil and gas, even if he makes it sound that easy?
No, not really. Energy independence is a good goal. But achieving it requires a long-term strategy, one that considers environmental concerns, economic needs, and the global energy market as a whole. Speaking of global considerations, one of the things that worries me most in these transcripts is his rhetoric about foreign policy, especially when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. He claims the war in Ukraine wouldn't have even happened if he were president, that he could have stopped Putin with the phone call. He even said that Biden and Harris have brought us to the brink of World War III. Is any of that even remotely plausible, or is it just more bluster?
Well, it's important to remember his relationship with Putin, which was complicated to say the least. He often praised Putin's strength and intelligence, and he downplayed Russia's interference in the 2016 election. So his claim that he could have stopped the war in Ukraine is just speculation.
It's like he's trying to rewrite history, to make himself look like this master negotiator, the only one who could have stopped this.
Right. And that fits into his broader narrative.
Yeah.
The one where he's the only one who can handle these authoritarian leaders, like Putin and Xi Jinping.
But doesn't that mean he's downplaying the very real threat posed by Russia and China? Especially since he keeps saying the real enemy is here in America, the deep state and the woke left.
That's a very good point. By framing the enemy as an internal one, he further divides the country and creates this environment of fear and distrust. It's a tactic that plays into his base's anxieties and reinforces his role as their protector, their savior.
It's like he's drawing a line in the sand. You're either with us or against us, and if you're not with him, you're part of the problem.
And that brings us to his claims about the 2020 election. He still says it was rigged. He's even comparing himself to Al Capone, because he's been indicted 4 times now, which is actually more than Al Capone. He says the Democrats are trying to silence him
Oh,
because he's standing in their way.
he's making himself out to be a martyr,
Yeah.
victim of this massive conspiracy.
Exactly. It's a continuation of that stolen election story he's been telling since 2020. And this narrative does a few things. It delegitimizes his opponents, it undermines trust in democracy, and it could even be used to justify any actions he might take to overturn the results of this election.
And don't forget what he said about his supporters needing to start screaming if they see any signs of cheating. That's scary, even irresponsible, given how politically divided things are right now.
It's definitely an attempt to rile up his base, to keep them fired up and ready to fight the results if they don't go his way.
Yeah.
And it's not just about fighting the results, it's about delegitimizing the entire process.
So where does that leave us? What's the end game?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It's like we're stuck in this crazy cycle of like fear and rhetoric, and it's hard to see a way out, you know? But I keep wondering if this is how he's running his campaign, what does it tell us about how he'd actually be as president if he gets a second term?
That's the question that's on everyone's mind, I think. Trying to figure out what he really wants to do. It's like trying to nail jelly to a wall. But if we take a close look at these rallies, there are some themes that pop up again and again. And they give some clues.
Okay, so give me the inside scoop. What kind of America is he hinting at?
Well, one big thing is this whole idea of restoring law and order, especially in cities. He's going on and on about what he calls radical left prosecutors and policies, saying they've let crime get totally out of control.
He even wants to bring back stop and frisk, which everyone knows was super controversial. People said it was discriminatory. And then there's the whole thing about deporting millions of undocumented immigrants. He calls them criminals and terrorists. Even though the data shows immigrants actually commit crimes at lower rates than people born in the U.S., it feels like he's trying to turn people against each other.
Yeah, this law and order message is nothing new. But this time it's definitely aimed at certain communities, if you live in a city, if you're a minority. This rhetoric is designed to make you feel scared, like you're under attack. But is that fear based on reality? Or is it just being manufactured to get votes?
It's a good question. And what about his stance on foreign policy? It sounds like he wants to be more isolationist, like America should just go it alone.
He's all about American strength. But it often comes at the expense of our relationships with other countries. He talks about ending the forever wars and bringing troops home, which might sound good at first, but it ignores all the complexities of those conflicts and the potential consequences if the U.S. just pulls out.
And he seems to like these strongman leaders like Putin and Xi.
Yeah.
He's even said maybe we should leave NATO, which has been like the foundation of Western security for decades. It's a huge change from how America has always approached foreign policy.
It definitely is.
Yeah.
And a lot of experts are really worried about what it could mean for the world.
So less global involvement, a more aggressive approach to law enforcement, and a focus on so-called traditional values. Is that a fair summary of what he might do in a second term?
Based on what we're hearing at these rallies, it seems like that's the general idea. He's still talking about tax cuts, deregulation, more fossil fuels, and he's going after things like critical race theory and what he calls transgender insanity.
Yeah.
It's a playbook designed to appeal to his base. It plays on their anxieties about cultural change and economic uncertainty.
He even said he'd cut federal funding for schools that teach critical race theory or have mask or vaccine mandates. And let's not forget about his promise to keep men out of women's sports. He's trying to start a culture war.
It seems like it.
It feels like he's trying to divide the country to win an election.
And I think that's the most important thing to remember here. These rallies aren't really about explaining a clear plan for the country. They're about telling a story about a nation that's under attack, on the verge of collapse. It's a very powerful story, and it really resonates with people who feel like their way of life is disappearing.
So it's about making people afraid, making them angry,
Yeah.
and then presenting himself as the only one who can save them. But what happens when that fear and anger is directed at other Americans? What happens when those chants at his rallies turn into actual policies?
That's what we all need to be thinking about as we get closer to the election. This isn't just about picking a president. It's about choosing what kind of country we want to live in. Do we want a country defined by fear and division, Or do we want a country that embraces hope and unity? A country with a shared vision for the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like we're living in this weird movie, and we don't know how it's going to end.
Right.
But, okay, so if this is how he's campaigning now, what does that tell us about how he'd actually govern if he got a second term? Like, would it be more of the same?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? Like, trying to figure out his real agenda. It's tough.
For sure.
But if you look at these rallies, there are definitely some patterns.
What kind of patterns are we talking about?
Well, one big one is this whole idea of restoring law and order,
Hmm.
especially in cities.
He talks about that a lot.
He does. He's constantly going after what he calls radical left prosecutors
Yeah.
and their policies. He says they've let crime spiral out of control.
He even said he wants to bring back stop and frisk, which a lot of people thought was discriminatory.
Right.
And then there's that whole thing about deporting millions of undocumented immigrants, calling them criminals, terrorists.
He uses some pretty strong language.
He does, even though statistically immigrants commit crimes at lower rates than people born in the U.S.
Yeah.
It feels like he's purposely trying to pit people against each other.
This law and order message is nothing new for him,
Mm.
but this time it feels more targeted. If you live in a city, if you're a minority, this rhetoric is designed to make you feel afraid.
So it's about creating fear.
Yeah. But the question is that fear based in reality?
Right.
Or is it being manufactured for political gain?
That's a good question. And speaking of things that make people nervous, what about foreign policy? It sounds like he wants America to be more isolated, like we should just do our own thing.
He's definitely emphasizing American strength. But that often comes at the expense of our alliances with other countries.
Like, what do you mean?
Well, he talks about ending the forever wars, bringing the troops home, which sounds good on the surface, but it ignores how complicated those conflicts really are and what could happen if America just pulls out.
And he seems to really admire these authoritarian leaders, like Putin and Xi.
It's true.
He's even suggested that maybe America should leave NATO, which has been like the bedrock of Western security for decades.
It's a big shift.
It is. So if we're trying to sum this up, less involvement in the world, a tougher approach to law enforcement, and a focus on traditional values.
Is that what a second term under Trump would look like?
Based on these rallies, that seems to be the direction he's heading. He's still pushing for tax cuts, deregulation, more fossil fuels. And he's attacking things like critical race theory, what he calls transgender insanity.
Yeah, it's like he's reading from a playbook we've seen before.
In a way, he is. One that's designed to appeal to his base by tapping into their anxieties about cultural change and the economy.
Exactly.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What do you want them to remember from this deep dive?
I think the most important thing to remember is that these rallies are about more than just policy. They're about telling a story about a nation in crisis, a nation on the verge of collapse. It's a powerful story. And for a lot of people, it feels very real.
So how do we make sense of all this? How do we cut through the noise and figure out what's really going on?
I think it comes down to asking ourselves some tough questions about the kind of country we want to be, about the future we want to build, and about the role we each want to play in shaping that future.
Well said. This has been The Deep Dive. Thanks for listening.